Hello guys, it's me and the Tank Index here, and today we're going to be talking about the Mark VI, Mark VII, Mark VIII, and Mark IX British landships, which are essentially the last landships ever designed because they were basically right at the tail end of the war in 1917 or 1918, and after the war the concept was obsolete even by 1919, so these are essentially the last ones, and we're going to be talking about them today. So first of all, we have the Mark VI, which is essentially what the British engineers were calling the next generation of landships. So the Mark V was, as we talked about in the last video, the most advanced tank you could possibly build with the original Mark I hull, while the Mark VI was essentially designing a whole new hull for a new generation of landships, which would be instrumental in the planned 1919 offensives. But, however, the problem was that once America joined the war in 1917, the project was scrapped because the Mark VI was designed with British industry in mind, which was, well, much smaller than the Americans' massive industrial capacity. So the project was scrapped once America joined the war because a standardized tank was needed for America, England, and France for the theoretical 1919 offensives. Only one wooden mock-up, which is seen on the right, was produced. Below it you can see a colored diagram someone drew. The main armament was going to be a single 6-pounder CWT gun in the front, as you know, the armament of most landships, with 2 machine guns on the right, 2 on the top box, and possibly 1 in the back, though I'm not sure on that. The crew would have had a theoretical crew of 6, with a driver, commander, and 4 gunners. Wider 75 tracks were going to be implemented, and as well as no sponsons, unlike the other landships. However, this theoretical design would have been a horror to command, as a top non-moving turret little gun box thing would be cramped with 3 people in it, unless the machine guns were also used by the commander, but that would be overtasking him, so either way, the commander of this tank would basically despise it. 600 were initially ordered but were cancelled for the Mark VIII. Next we have the Mark VII, which the Mark VII was essentially another tank built off an extended Mark I hull. It contained advanced hydraulic transmissions and improved steering, being a much more maneuverable design. While there was an order for 74 built because, well, even though, as we'll soon talk about, the Mark V was supposed to be the most advanced Mark I hull, there were still a lot of hulls left over, and a lot of factories were still very capable of producing Mark I hulls. So another one was designed anyway. So there's an order for 74, but only 3 were built before it was cancelled in favor of the Mark VIII. So the problem with the Mark VII is the Mark VII was a much more advanced version of the original hull, but it entirely ignores the existence and purpose of the Mark V. The Mark V was specifically designed to be the best version of the, at that time, outdated Mark I hull. It was supposed to be the final one in the hull, and then a new one would be designed with better technology in it. But the Mark I hull was to be retired after the Mark V. So the Mark VII, why is it another advanced version necessary? The Mark VII was entirely unnecessary in this design because the Mark V already did its job. And this was just retreading old ground. Next we have the Mark VIII, which is going to be the main point of the video. So there was a British version and an American version built. The British male version had 2 6-pounder CWT guns and 7 Hotchkiss machine guns, while the American male version would have 2 6-pounder CWT guns and 5 M1917 Browning machine guns. It would have an average speed of 5.25 miles per hour with a theoretical max speed of 6.25 miles an hour, making it the fastest landship in concept, at least the fastest heavy one. And it would have an operational distance of 50 miles. The armor varied wildly. At max it was 16 millimeters in the front, while at the lowest it's probably around 8. But weirdly enough, unlike the Mark VI, it actually has sponsons again, which I don't know why they would do that. The tank would be a much larger 38 tons, which makes sense because the crew size is also larger. The American version would have a size of 10 men, while the British version would have a size of 12. Though some estimates put it almost on par with the A-7B at a size of 16, but 16 men does seem pretty sketchy with even British engineers at that time, they must have known that that would not be a very well ergonomically tested tank. And the backstory of the Mark VIII is pretty interesting. So the Mark VI and VII were designed with the British industrial capacity in mind. The Mark VI was, basically what could Britain produce, and the Mark VII was, well, we're already producing this, so maybe we should just make more, especially since we have some leftovers. While the Mark VIII was specifically designed with Anglo-American engineers with the idea of America's massive industry in mind. Once America joined the war, it was basically the best ground to mass-produce tank parts. The idea was for Britain to supply the tanks holes in weaponry while America produced the automotive parts. The reason the Mark VIII Liberty was nicknamed the International was because it would be mass-produced to supply France, Britain, and the US with tanks. France couldn't really contribute anything because their industry was essentially gone by this time, with Germany having taken most of their industrial regions earlier in the war. Both sides with America and England pitching ideas. The Mark VIII was supposed to standardize a single tank design for a theoretical 1919 offensives with a single tank doctrine, so everyone would be using the same tanks, which is always a good idea, especially if you're all fighting in the same ground. But once the war ended, 100 vehicles were sent to the U.S., which were used until the 30s, though likely after the 20s. Honestly, these were probably just surplus or training equipment in tiny military bases in, Utah. And the other 25 staying in England. Only 125 were produced because after World War I, with trenches no longer being the massive enemy they were earlier, as landships and concepts were kind of bust. At the start of World War II, America sent all their 100 tanks to Canada for training, though honestly Canada would probably already have some British design by that point, though honestly, who knows, the Mark VIII might have been better than the British design to World War II, because those were pretty shitty. Please, I hope you know I'm joking, because I do not want to get roasted in the comments. Next up we have the Mark IX, which it had a weight of 27 tons, but since it would carry up to 30 men, not even counting its crew, its weight would be much larger. The 4-man crew included a mechanic, which would definitely be needed, as we'll talk about soon, a driver, a commander, and a machine gunner. It had 2.303 machine guns and loopholes in it that soldiers could open to fire their rifles from inside. It had an average speed of 4 miles an hour and a very, very poor operational distance of 20 miles. The Mark IX was designed because essentially the heavy landships, right, like the Mark V or 4, were designed to break through enemy lines. However, then infantry soldiers couldn't really follow them in through enemy lines because, unlike the giant tanks, they were very susceptible to machine guns. So the Mark I was designed to basically bring troops through machine gun fire into the combat zone, and they would jump out and fight. It was really the first armored personnel carrier, but honestly, its general idea wasn't truly pursued until the APCs of the Cold War, with in World War II and the interwar years instead half-tracks like the M3 being designed, which is pretty interesting how it switched. There were a lot of arguments with the Mark IX, though. The low operational distance and the fact that soldiers would get so sick by the fumes that they'd come out of the vehicle not ready to fight and instead ready to throw up everywhere didn't really make generals like the idea. They requested sponsons and more guns to basically just turn into a standard landship, which the designers argued with very much, and only 34 were built by the end of the war. Trials were actually attempted to turn the Mark IX into the first amphibious tank, which you can see in these pictures, which is pretty interesting, though. Relying on barrels on the side of your tank to cross water isn't exactly the best idea. Or armored ambulances, which they probably could have been good for, but honestly, even horses would be better at that with their better speed. But they mainly remained as infantry carriers, to be honest. A lot of them after the war were converted to just normal supply carriers, and they did that job, honestly, better than any other converted landships, because they were actually designed to transport things. So, supply carriers, these are actually good for. But, the final assessment of these tanks, the quality of the tanks really ranged from poor to decent. The Mark VII was completely unnecessary in its purpose, and ignored the already mass-produced Mark V. The Mark VI was a very competent design if the war had continued into 1919 without America in it, but it was obsolete when not driving through deep trenches, and also kind of underpowered considering what they could do with America. How on the other side, the Mark VIII Liberty would have been a great, fantastic standardized, mass-produced tank in the planned 1919 offensives, especially because America could help mass-produce them. However, the end of the war with the Treaty of Versailles in 1918 caused each of these to have really little purpose other than training, showing off to other countries, testing with them, testing new concepts with them, or just to have tanks in general. Because, after the war, honestly, tanks were kind of being argued about, should we keep using them? Are they kind of useless now? I mean, what are we going to do with them? Until, honestly, testing in the 20s were like, yeah, we should probably keep using these, which was solidified in the Spanish-American War. But the Mark IX is the diamond in the rough of all of these. The infantry carrier paved the way for armored personnel carriers in the future, and also sort of began the concept of amphibious tanks. It was ahead of its time in both areas, however, it really wasn't appreciated when it was created and not taken seriously, which resulted in no other enhanced versions being created, though this was probably also in part due to, Britain and France were kind of broke after World War One. I guess they could have sensed that America could design something, but at the same time, after World War One, they were going into another one of its isolationist phases, which America tends to do after a massive war. Except World War Two, where they just started proxy warring everyone to try to one up the Soviet Union. But yeah, so that's basically my video on the last Landships. On Friday, I will give you guys a video on the 4 British medium tanks of World War One. The medium Mark A Whippet, the medium Mark B Whippet, yes, they are named the same thing, which we will cover, the medium Mark C Hornet, and the medium Mark D. So tune into that one if you are interested. It's going to be a very interesting video in my opinion. But yeah, until that time, this will be the tank index. Out. Hope you enjoyed the video.